Are you able to like just paint a picture of some basic ideas that political theorists throughout the world have come up with, and then we'll take it from
Sure.
there.
Yeah, I mean, going back in history is a little bit tough, and I'll tell you in a moment why. But again, let's focus on the fundamental question, which is how to live together. Or we are all playing this game, but what should the rules of the games be, right? And I mean, in popular consciousness, you can think about the ancient Greek idea of democracy, which we still live with. And you would hear that the Athenians used to have direct democracy. So they had a certain justification for it, that if there are 10 people and we have to decide simple things like whether we should construct this building or not, all 10 of them should have a say in it directly, right? That's not the sort of democracy that we live in today in most places where we have representatives, for example. But if I talk more about political theory as a discipline, normally, at least in Western political theory, it's organized in the form of a canon, right? I'm sure your listeners would have heard of Plato and Socrates, for example. They are usually so. And there's some debate whether Plato and Socrates were actually the same person, but let's assume they were different, right? Yeah. And Plato starts in this book called The Republic, the fundamental question, which is what is justice? And this is a term that you'll hear political theorists talking about a lot, justice, right? And he spends the whole book thinking about what is justice. And by the end, you're still not sure whether he gives you a clear answer. But what he does is reject some hypothesis. So he does not say, justice is the happiest society you can have. He says justice is something else. And to be fair, I mean, that's the question that political theorists still are asking. So if you ask me what is justice, I won't be able to give you one-line justification. Then in the canon came someone like Aristotle. So Aristotle focused a little bit more on personal virtues, flourishing, the idea of eudaimonia, right? That you can, in conjunction with society, by structuring your community in a certain way, you can achieve certain high levels of human flourishing. So probably Aristotle comes quite close to combining psychology and politics in that way.
Absolutely. Right? And that's an explicitly stated goal, not
yes.
just implicitly derived.
Exactly. And that's a debate that you still find somewhere in political theory. So there are the Aristotelians or the neo-Aristotelians who want to combine the two fields. And then there is someone like I don't think you can call them, the Socratic philosophers, let's say, right? Who draw this distinction between ideal and non-ideal, and who are trying to get at the truth, right? They think the point of philosophy is to get at the truth, whether that makes us happy or not, right? But if they are not really talking about a lot of problems that we face today about how to live together. And then comes in, let's say, someone like Hobbes, right? Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher in the 17th century, and he's saying, what justifies the king? Right? So there was the British monarchy, and if you think about it, like imagine some aliens coming on a planet, or even us going back in time machine, and you're seeing millions of people just following this one person. And the son of that person, right? Why? And Hobbes sort of gives you a justification, an explanation for it. And he draws this distinction between a state of nature and civilization. So he does some bit of speculative history, and he says, imagine if we didn't have any government. And you ask that question to a person on the street, and they say, oh my God, that's going to be chaos, because it's going to be a war against war, of all against all, right? If somebody steals something from me, and if I don't have a police to report to, what do I do? So we are constantly afraid of each other. And Hobbes basically articulated that idea. And Hobbes was trying to say, and at that time, the English Civil War was about to happen. So he had fled England. And he was saying that, look, you might not be happy with the king, but let him stay. Because the alternative is this sort of state of nature, right? And that sort of thinking still goes on in modern political theory, although, of course, we've come a long way from there, at least in liberal democracies, where we are saying, yes, we don't want chaos, but also the only other option is not a monarchy, right?
I see.
And then comes in someone like Rousseau, who actually challenges that idea, right? Rousseau was a French philosopher who spent a lot of time in Switzerland, and he said, you know what? You're trying to imagine what a state of nature would look like by looking at people today, right? Who are already born in governments, who are distrustful of each other. But maybe we can imagine a world where there was no government and people were not so distrustful of each other. So in fact, he's saying that civilization has done more harm to us than good. And his basic explanation for that is that, look, there is enough for everyone. At least there was enough for everyone in his time. And maybe one could argue that there is still is. If we just think about individual desires, like what I want materially, etc. But Rousseau is saying the moment we enter civilization, he has this very interesting quote that people, you talked about the hunter-gatherer society, so maybe they gathered around a fire and then they started dancing, and then suddenly there was a need for someone to dance the best, right? And there was this need for social competition. And Rousseau says that's what civilization does to you. It shows you a mirror, and then it generates all these desires in you to be superior to someone else. And then the problem begins, because then there is not enough for everyone, and that's where the conflict starts, right? So Rousseau sort of comes in and challenges this sort of story.
Sure.
I mean, again, whoever is a bit familiar with these thinkers would know that I'm brushing past them very quickly, right? But just to give you an idea of how the story has evolved.
Sure. Is just so what I'm understanding is it fair to say that Hobbes was a bit highlighted more of the pessimistic side of what goes wrong and that kind of thing, and Rousseau was talking more of the optimistic side? Would that be too much of an oversimplification?
You're not entirely wrong in saying that. People often read Hobbes as being incredibly afraid of humans and being very pessimistic. But maybe Rousseau cannot be called an optimistic. So Rousseau did not think that the solution is to abolish civilization and go back. So he doesn't think that's possible. But he does think that a refined form of civilization is possible, where social competition does not play so much of a role in our societies, right? So there is less of a conflict. But he had a better view of human nature than Hobbes did, right? And then came someone like Kant. So Kant and Rousseau said, look, this refined form of civilization basically is where we can live on our own terms, right? We don't have to necessarily follow the authority of a king. We can decide how to live. And Kant sort of tried to flesh that out. What would it mean to live on our own terms, right? And then there are various thinkers. Perhaps another important thinker is Marx, right? I'm sure. So the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx is the second most read book in the world, right? And the first is the Bible. So he was that influential. And of course, there are people who hate him, who like him still, etc. And Marx came in and said that, look, this whole story that you're talking about, the state, etc., it's a very bourgeois story. It's about people who actually own property. If you look at it from the perspective of people who don't own anything, this is not the kind of state we want. In fact, it's possible to live in a society where there are no classes, no sense of private ownership of property, at least means of production. There is no state, and it's possible to live in a society like that. Now comes the big break, right? So if you look after Marx, at least in Western political thought, there is a dead period, right? And the explanation for that is the two big wars, right? Because it's in these wars, people have seen the dangers of grand ideas. So they've seen the dangers of fascism in Germany, and they've seen the dangers of communism. So what people see is that, okay, look, thousands, millions of people got very inspired by these ideas, but the moment you go and try and implement them, you face a lot of resistance because, again, not everyone agrees with it, right? You want a communist society that looks great on paper, but what do you do if not everyone's following the rules, right? And then the society turns repressive. So people said, you know what? These political theorists are ruining our world. They're just giving us grand ideas which are not workable, right? But then, at least in Western theory, comes someone like John Rawls, who was an American philosopher who served in the US military himself during the Second World War. And he said, look, political theory still has a role to play, but it should be much more humble, right? So we should start with some basic facts. Those facts are people disagree. There are some people who are not going to comply. And we should keep those facts in mind when trying to think about what a good society should look like. And you can say in a way that the kind of political theory that now we do is, or let's say at least I do, which is the analytical political theory, is more in that Rawlsian style.
I see. And Rawlsian style being, it's not too invasive of, it's a bit on the side. There's a much more of a humility to it.
It's more focused on smaller problems. I mean, it's still in an abstract way, but we are not saying, okay, let's start the society from the beginning and I'm going to paint a picture of a good society. It's not like that. And of course, now political theory is also changing because there were two main criticisms of this canon. So if you would have noticed, everyone I've talked about is a white man, right? So one criticism came from the feminists who said that not only are we only focusing on the thoughts of white men, although there were women also talking about politics, we've also missed out on some crucial things like the family, right? We mentioned earlier, like family is probably the first political institution any child gets exposed to. Yeah. And we know from personal experience that who we are is so fundamentally determined by where I was born, like where I was socialized, etc. And these political theorists often fail to focus on those sorts of questions. So there came feminists like Nancy Fraser, for example, or Elizabeth Anderson, who said, look, we also need to talk about the gender division of labor and the male bias in Western political theory. And then the second sort of challenge came from someone like Charles Mills, who said this is also based on a very racist taxonomy, right? So if you remember when I was talking about Hobbes, I said there's this distinction between a state of nature and civilization. And a lot of times when these authors were talking about the state of nature, they were saying, look at the Native Americans. Look, so I think Locke even has this quote that the king in Native Americans is worse off than a peasant in Britain, right? Which is to suggest that, look, we have made progress, they have not, right? And that sort of thinking, some ways, is still pervades Western thinking. Sure. So then there was this sort of political theorist who said, no, look, there are other systems of thought. There is an Indian political canon, there is an African political canon, there is a Latin American political canon. First, you also need to pay attention to this. And second, you need to acknowledge that what you're saying about what states should do differs vastly when it's applied to the UK as compared to when it's applied to India, right? Because India has had to reconcile with this 200 years of a colonial past, for example. So yeah, to cut it very long story short, there is a canon, and this canon is more to tell you like how the kinds of questions we ask has evolved themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose, well, first of all, thank you for painting that. It's not an easy task to go through all of political theory and then paint such a clear and beautiful picture. I suppose there's just for good reasons you have not included anyone like Confucius, and the reason would probably be that in the well, first of all, there's just too many of them to talk about, but also, is it fair to say that they do not get as much attention in at least the academic style of work that you do, or they've obviously not been not influential, because if you go to China, everyone will know who Confucius is and will be influenced by those ideas. So is it the same thing that the feminists were saying, that we've sort of left them behind through male-centric white bias? Or do you think it's something more to do with ideas that they were not applicable in the West or something like that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about someone like Confucius, or let's say Gandhi and Ambedkar in India. Like, sure. we are familiar with it, but if you ask political theorists here, even like, I don't know, people who have been teaching for 20 years, they would often have not read those theories. And I think that comes from a bias in Western academia where they would say, yes, Confucius and Gandhi were saying something important, but they were saying something important about China and India. So they get regionalized. Whereas when you read Hobbes or Locke or whoever, then there is this idea that, look, their ideas can be applicable everywhere, right? And to some extent, there are some attempts being made in the Western academy to challenge that, right? We are thinking about how to integrate these other non-Western thinkers into the main canon. As for the feminists, the problem is slightly different, right? They were saying that, look, in the same house, there were authors who were writing, just their writing was not being publicized, right? And they were also writing something that's very relevant to your own context, right? It's very relevant to your own family. So they were challenging more this bias. And that's why I think to some extent, feminist political theory has still made a little more headways. I think feminist movement has been a bit more successful in that way, where you can see that political theory has become a lot more responsive to those demands now.
Beautiful. Yeah, I just